Jestem w Gdańsku.
This is Gdansk. You can count on anywhere in the northern Baltic having at least two names. Two languages, two cultures, two former colonizers at least. Gdansk is currently in Poland.
Ich bin in Danzig.
Throughout its history, it has been occupied and reoccupied, subjugated and liberated.
Allotment gardens did not belong to hobbyists. They were near necessities throughout long decades of shortages. They are de facto monuments to oppression and to hunger in a part of Europe which abounds in official monuments, mostly monuments to hypocrisy.
Gdansk might be said to be the founding city of modern Poland. The shipyard strikes initially occasioned by the sacking of the crane operator and former welder Anna Valentinowicz were led by Lech Wałęsa and led in turn to the founding of Solidarity, which in further turn led to suppression, martial law and state-sanctioned murder.
This is where the Soviet Empire first began to crumble, where communism, toothless and weakened by itself, began to capitulate in a way that it hadn't at the time of the Hungarian uprising or the Prague Spring.
This might be considered appropriate, but Gdansk belonged to the Hanseatic League, God's first attempt at the EU, which was born out of something other than an ism. It grew rich out of enterprise, out of trade. Of course, trade may also be an ideology, but it's an ideology with a small I, and it's practical, flexible, undogmatic. W.B. Yeats wrote, "The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity." It's unlikely that he had in mind the bourgeois merchants of the Hanse as exemplars of the best.
Vodka i slerge.
The Hanse were civilian. Their virtues were civic. They made cities, not war. They did not raise armies, nor did they put to sail in men of war. Nonetheless, Hanse shipping required protection against pirates and privateers such as the Victuals Brotherhood, who were based on the island of Gotland, which may or may not be the original home of the Goths. And Hanse cities too needed defences. Security solutions were outsourced. Ausgliedern in German. The mercenary brawn with whom the Hanse entered into an enduring contract was the Order of Teutonic Knights, a sect of muscular Christian warriors formed in Palestine during the Crusades. They had a taste for tournaments, and their buildings are tournament pavilions frozen forever in brick. The Teutonic Knights were supposedly celibate, supposedly chivalric, certainly militant, given to hunting, and practiced in faith-based belligerence initiatives. They were hungry for territory, which they received in return for their freelance campaigns. Missionary zeal is invariably a bid for colonization. The Teutonic Knights and the Hanse became mutually dependent. The order built castles such as Marienburg, now Malbork, in the hinterland of Gdansk. Its sheer immensity had not previously been seen. It remains startling today, a red brick Carcassonne, largely unknown in Britain because, unlike Carcassonne, it belongs to the north. The Teutonic Knights considered conversion by force to be legitimate, even if the non-believers in question, that is, non-Christians, posed neither the ideological nor the political threat that Islam did in the countries bordering the Eastern Mediterranean. It was considered especially legitimate if the unfortunate non-believers occupied lands that were rich in minerals and natural products, trees, furry animals, fossilized resin such as amber, aurochs, tar, peat. The Order's crusade, or land grab, was directed against Lithuania, the last pagan country, sandwiched between the easternmost diocese of the Roman Church and the westernmost outposts of the Russian Orthodox. It's largely due to these churches' black propaganda that we've been brainwashed into believing that paganism signifies incivility, coarseness, violence, and so on. It didn't, and it still doesn't, despite its having been co-opted by various guises of heavy metal. Pagan was a blanket word, born of fanatical zeal and bigoted incuriosity, which dismissed countless sorts of belief. It's a synonym of heathen, and it derives ultimately from the same root as the word peasant. It signifies then people who lived in the country, that's to say in the forests rather than in towns. During the Middle Ages, Lithuania was the most organized, most powerful state in Eastern Europe. It was officially pagan. It was, however, religiously tolerant and did not persecute Christians or Jews. Its people mostly venerated nature. They were animists. That's to say, they regarded everything as possessing some sort of spirit or soul. Something along those lines anyway. They were polytheistic. Their pantheon included a god of the sun, a god of the moon, a god of lightning, a god of rain, a god of drizzle, a god of possible precipitation by the end of the 11th day after the first apple ripens.
Flowers, fruit, crops, trees, these were all worshipped, especially trees. Humans were reincarnated as trees. Trees formed sacred groves.
The forest, as dark a place to medieval Christians as it was to the thinkers of the Enlightenment, was to these pagans the very site of their civilization. People ritually dressed as storks, bears, bulls, stags, goats, horses, and boars. Their religion, or system of superstition, was indigenous and as appropriate as religion ever could be, since it revered the materials that their life depended on: wood, water, horses, berries, fungus, and so on, and it thanked the imaginary gods for them. The ubiquitous forests are full of beasts. They're dark, enclosing, monotonous, frightening. The bark of birches compensates for the lack of venomous snakes. Grass snakes were worshipped for want of other snakes.
Deserts incite a different sort of fantasy or superstition, the fantasy of monotheism. At least that's how it seems. For the three Abrahamistic monotheistic cults, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all emerge from the same Middle Eastern deserts and all believe in the same God. The fun and games down the years has preposterously been about which particular prophet owns the exclusive rights to the God franchise.
And so these monotheistic faiths might be considered singularly unsuitable in the cold, dank north of birches, pines, mosquitoes, bogs and bog bodies. However, Christianity did thrive. The Teutonic Knights knocked the love of one god, one fictive delusion, into people who had previously had many gods, many fictive delusions. The Knights' evangelical assault suggests that a religion is no more than a cult with an army attached to it. The indigenous religion was driven underground, to be periodically exhumed by those with elephantine folk memories. The imported religion promised that no matter how dour this life may be, and life in the north was dour, everything will be just dandy in the next life if you believe in and worship the one God. So it enjoyed an understandable appeal. The number of churches in Vilnius might be held to attest to that appeal. The city is as triumphantly Baroque as Rome. The Counter-Reformation style of the Catholic Church was gross, vulgar, populist, energetic, thrilling. But it was hardly Lithuanian. It is Italian by way of Poland, which had annexed Lithuania.
So the majority of these churches were designed by Poles. And like most architects before and since, they were enthusiastic followers of fashion. They doggedly ransacked the Italian pattern book for ideas.
This was then a double colonization, a double invasion. But that is Lithuania's fate. It has been so frequently invaded and colonized and annexed that its buildings are the calling cards of its violators, who of course did not see themselves as violators. These churches may imitate Italy's, but they could never be taken for Italian. Their surroundings, their conjunction with the street, their materials, the light that illuminates them, all these are unmistakably northern. And so is the routinely vain attempt to appear southern, to seize at a link with the sun, if only by association.
Vilnius's most fascinating church, however, is an exception to the touchingly hopeless aspiration to southernness. Furthermore, it is not Baroque. Well, not formally Baroque, not chronologically Baroque. It belongs actually to the later Middle Ages.
Yet, in the restlessness of its many devices, and in the very form of certain of those devices, it appears to predict the Baroque. Because architectural history is founded in what happened in the south, in Italy, it remains unthinkingly biased towards that country. So to talk of an architectural renaissance in the north is to apply to Northern Europe the inappropriate model of the south.
In the north, things happened differently. The Gothic, born in northern France and naturalized everywhere north of northern France, endured far longer here than it did in places south of the Loire, places such as Italy, where Gothic was a term of abuse, like pagan.
More than half a millennium after it was supposedly Christianized, Lithuania still clings both to vestiges of its pagan polytheism and to a preoccupation with its forests. One reason for this is because forests are larders, full of partridges, boars, bears, and even beaver.
I've never eaten bear, but I have eaten beaver, and I highly recommend it.
Not this kind of beaver, though. This beaver is, it's like spaniel. It's like spaniel dipped in cod liver royal.
Lithuania's lakes too are larders. Perch, roach, tench, chub, and most especially pike and carp. They're caught for the table, not to be put in a keep net, photographed and thrown back. The Jewish, specifically Ashkenazi culinary repertoire includes countless recipes for freshwater fish. In the Book of Jewish Food, well named for it is the book, Claudia Roden lists sweet and sour, jellied, formed into dumplings, fried and eaten cold, salted, fried and subsequently pickled. Before they murdered their victims, the Nazis devised many minor humiliations for them. Leviticus, for instance, specifically prohibits the tattooing of the human body. Again, Auschwitz was revered and renowned throughout the Jewish world for the quality of the carp that had been bred in ponds there since they were introduced by Jewish merchants from China in the 1600s. Jewish cooking has all but disappeared from Lithuania. A way of life was extinguished with a race. What does remain is a curious anomaly. The Karaim in Lithuania are of Crimean and Eastern Turkish origin. Because they do not acknowledge rabbinical interpretations of the Talmud, they were considered apostates. For this reason, and because of their Tatar bloodline, the SS's Race and Settlement Office decreed that the Karaim were not to be considered Jewish. Thus they were spared. Some even fought for the Nazis. In the town of Trakai, a small community still prospers. It worships its Knesses and runs a series of cafes which specialise in kibinai, which is what Cornish pasties ought to be, but seldom are. The dish and word kibinai are evidently related to kibe, which are found in the Eastern Mediterranean.
This is not just food. This is Karaim food.
The Karaim's cafes stare out onto a medieval castle. Admittedly, alongside the Teutonic Knights Malbork, it is little more than a starter castle. Nonetheless, it's a graphic illustration of Lithuania's former might. Karaim apart, less than 20,000 Jews survived the Second World War in Lithuania. Probably 250,000 had been massacred, in the camps, by firing squads, by mobile gas chambers. Forests can be made as beautiful or as ugly as humans want them to be. The victims were of many nationalities. Some were of families who had lived here for generations. Some had sought refuge here. Others had been transported from across Europe to what were to become the earliest killing fields in the war on unarmed civilians. Many of the murderers, however, were not Germans, but Lithuanians, who considered themselves to be partisans and enthusiastically collaborated with the Nazis. To them, the Nazis, who drove out the occupying Soviet army, were liberators. Here, perhaps, is the defining tragedy of the Baltic states, the way that their people have been forced to make the most terrible compromising choices between murderous regimes. The Soviet occupations, which totaled more than half a century, cost more lives than the Nazis.
Soviet memorials are then merely victors' memorials. They smugly and mendaciously obliterate the USSR's crimes, whilst quite properly drawing attention to those of the Third Reich. They are, of course, official memorials, yesterday's official memorials. The Hill of Crosses near Shialai in the north of the country is, on the other hand, entirely unofficial, homemade, extemporized, a site of collective piety and melancholic remembrance, a national shrine.
This is thought to have been a place where pagan sacrifices were made. It is certainly a place where crosses were erected as early as 1831, at the time of an uprising against Russian rule. Whilst its imagery is explicitly Christian, it is evidently a vestige of the more ancient faith, which survived hidden underground during the long years of totalitarian suppression. During those years, folk art was the faith's only means of expression. That art had a vital purpose as a solace. It was a covert way of being Lithuanian, of taking pride in a nation which might one day be restored to its people.
The purpose of the Hill of Crosses quite overcomes the roughness with which it is put together. It is no doubt somewhat artless, like the dead flowers at the site of a fatal road accident. But it does show that the cliched manifestations of faith and grief and pathos and sadness and, who knows, gratitude are more important to a certain mindset than are any aesthetic considerations.
The Hill of Crosses turns pretty much an entire nation into outsider artists. It is a striking sight of impassioned and meaningful inarticulacy. The naive, untutored work of outsider artists is nothing if not a cry for help, a desperate, inchoate plea to an unlistening, uncomprehending, cruel world.
And that still applies even if the art is bought at a stall catering to presumably reverent tourists. Unlike, say, Lourdes, which is a temple to gullibility and mass-produced kitsch, the Hill of Crosses has the capacity to move, because it really is an unself-conscious national shrine born out of suffering and made by the people who suffered. Inevitably, the Soviets bulldozed the Hill of Crosses on several occasions. They burnt and smelted the crosses and icons and spread sewage on the site. Equally inevitably, like some stubborn plant, it reasserted itself. It was tit for tat. In its long decline after Khrushchev's deposal in 1964, the Soviet Union, never dreaming that the game might one day be up, persisted in imposing its architectural will on its colonies. This former hydrotherapy centre at Druskininkai offered the rain mischiefs, the salty moments, the embrace of Neptune, the Helfing shower.
This was a mecca of re-educative rectal tampons, sulfated mud wallows, peat packs, ideologically improving freezing hoses, climatological cures such as air therapy, going for a walk, and solar therapy, sunbathing. There were 10,000 such spa establishments across the Soviet Union, treating, if that's the word, 60 million people per annum. Hypertension, psoriasis, endocrine imbalance, lymphatic and renal disorders, the Neels, there was nothing that these places couldn't cure.
It is conceivable that they were merely placebos in concrete and stone. places which institutionalized the folk cures and nature remedies which a gullible public was attached to, not least as tokens of an old superstitious irrationalism. They now offer new remedies to an equally gullible public. Remedies such as piscine epidermal therapy. That's fish eating your dead skin cells. Like a cat's tongue. There is a lot going on here. Organic imagery off the Art Nouveau shelf, an attempt to create an architecture that's both gaudily bombastic and recognisably futuristic. These exercises in the Leonid Brezhnev plays Las Vegas style, which is also known as the dogs in space manner, possess the same menacing frivolity as Stalin's distended fantasies of the 40s and early 50s.
At another spa, Marianske Lazne, Marienbad, in the not yet former Czechoslovakia in the last days of Soviet dominion, the medical director, a tiny man with a mad boffin hairdo and mad boffin spectacles, told me with a worrying giggle, "People getting rid negative effect of everyday life. We reprogramming them." Yes, we reprogram people.
Today, the negative effects of everyday life are excised by other means. Nowadays, hotels and clubs in improbably rural, improbably sylvan settings offer fauna and massage.
Communist sexual puritanism, public sexual puritanism anyway, has abated. Spa patients are now punters. Steroid-enhanced psychiatric nurses who could toss a caber are now Botox-enhanced artistes who can, no doubt, also toss a caber.
Every country in the Baltic has its own distinctive form of traditional dancing. Poland has pole dancing, of which dirty Gdansking is a most unusual kind. Lapland has lap dancing, and Lithuania has lith dancing.
As for Estonia, Estonia Nation Special has full-on one-to-one, you wanting good old-time experience, extra care service, Mr. International Businessman. That's something to look forward to.
Be meeting at International Airport in deluxe luxury with lovely skill worker qualification girls dressed for showing the Mr. Top International Businessman best national secret delights at medieval city of Tallinn.
Of the Baltic states' capital cities, Tallinn is the most captivating, the smallest, the most northerly, and the most easterly. Thus the closest to Russia, yet of these cities it feels, by some measure, the furthest from the Soviet Union. Indeed, it's hard to believe that this Hanseatic city is a former satellite. It has more successfully extinguished traces of Soviet occupation than its neighbours Riga and Vilnius. This is not a risk-free position to adopt.
When in the spring of 2007 it was decided to shift, not destroy, merely move from this position in front of the National Library to a less conspicuous site, a monument to what were laughingly known as Soviet freedom fighters, Estonia was deemed by Moscow to have insulted the sacred feelings of the Russian people.
Needless to say, the protests against the dismantling of the monument were the work of agents provocateurs from the Putin-Jugend, the freelance paramilitaries happily known as the Nashi. Putin himself, who bears a personal grudge against Estonia on account of his father's treatment here during the Second World War, reacted with predictably hypocritical fury. You can take the man out of the KGB. The Russian Federation threatened unspecified retaliation, which came in the form of cyber attacks on businesses and institutions. This aggression was not taken particularly seriously by the self-hating Western liberal media, that is to say, most of the Western media. Compare that same media's reaction when in 2006 neo-Nazis polled a whopping 6% of the vote in the eastern German province of Mecklenburg-West Pomerania. It was as though the 117-year-old Adolf Hitler himself had returned from his Paraguayan estancia to reclaim power. The point, of course, is that despite nearly half a century of Cold War, despite the enormity and extent of its crimes, despite the totalitarian nature of Putin's regime, there still exists in Western Europe a risible tolerance of communism and neo-communism. Old commie and Nazi sympathizer carry entirely different connotations. The one, a lovable class warrior, all marks and cardis. The other, an embittered, inadequate, foaming paranoiac. In fact, the same obloquy should be visited on both. They're both beyond the pale. The ghosts of the recent past hang over the Baltic like a toxic cloud. When this museum was opened in 2003, it was, pointedly, called the Museum of Occupations, plural. The short Nazi occupation and the long Soviet one. Russia acted with its usual indignant hypocrisy, claiming that the exhibition puts the USSR on a par with Nazi Germany, which was surely the intention. In much of the former Eastern Bloc, in the former satellite states, in the former Soviet Union itself, you're constantly forced to wonder, what is it precisely that's so former about them? The fearfully cautious mentality, the xenophobia and insularity, the longing for regulation and state dependency, the ostalgia. These are just some of the signs that, although structures may have changed, minds, conditioned over decades, remain set in concrete. The only consolation can be that someone usually got the aggregate wrong and that the concrete crumbles. None of this seems to be the case in Tallinn. Tallinn is thriving. It is also elegant. It owes much of that elegance to Estonia having been both independent and prosperous between the First and Second World Wars. Lithuania was a Polish serf nation and economically devastated. Latvia was independent and economically devastated. Estonia linked itself to Finland, to Scandinavia, to Britain, by trade. Architecturally, it was alone among the Baltic states in adopting modernism, rather modernisms. One sort of modernism that it went in for suggests that Estonia, with less than 1% of the population of the Soviet Union, was daring to define itself as the antithesis of its vast neighbour, whose own architecture increasingly suggested that communism was nothing more than age-old Russian nationalism. This sort of modernism is Northern European. It's of specifically Hanseatic origin. We've seen this restless brickwork in the now distant cities of Bremen and Hamburg. The second form of modernism that Estonia embraced was white, rectilinear, cubistic. The bourgeoisie of the newly independent state after the First World War was massively enthused by it. Thousands of houses were built with state loans to encourage property ownership. Each house was designed by an architect, the antithesis of British speculative building of the same period. The resultant suburbs are as beguiling as those of Brussels. Modernism's attraction may not have been so much that it presaged the future, which it did, but that it carried no baggage. It was as far as could be from the architecture imposed by the former colonizer. It wasn't, save in the brains of such begetters as Le Corbusier, even European. Le Corbusier created something new by reproducing something old from a previously ignored culture. So, through a few influential and persuasive conduits, the architecture of Colombeychar and Casablanca, Tunis and Taroudant was reproduced on the Baltic shore. This is what is known as looking south. There can be no other small country, and the entire population is hardly more than that of Greater Glasgow, with such an appetite for architecture, especially domestic architecture, and with such an abundance of accomplished architects to satisfy that appetite.
But there's seldom anything specifically Estonian about the work of architects such as Emil Öberl, unless that is specifically Estonian in this context means well-made, highly crafted, and longing to be somewhere that it isn't.
It might be said that this is the elemental purpose of architecture, to create somewhere else, to create a new common identity. In the later 19th century, localization, folk music, national traditions and national consciousness were an international craze all over Europe. In Estonia, rock sport, banned by Peter the Great in 1714, was revived. And so was cake dressing of the dead, the custom whereby the eldest child smears a dead parent's face with batter to ensure that the parent will not go hungry in the journey to the afterlife.
You sing us 5 Estonian poets you are most studying. They're holding place lecture at sliding show in international renowned Dr. Jaan Tamm. Rejoice national fish herring from special dancing.
Special Estonian dancing is no longer national fish herring dancing. The dancing that Tallinn now offers the world is Est dancing. Every year, thousands of hideously dressed young or youngish ambassadors of British manhood visit Tallinn to enjoy, an approximate word, what are called stagger nights, to get legless, get lurching, get loud, get laid, should they be capable, and get a sexually transmitted disease to take home to Blighty.
These free-spending Lotharios make an impressive contribution to the country's annual €1 billion tourist income, so they're tolerated.
Of course they are. So they're paid dates, mostly itinerant operatives from Russia, and their paid dates' kindly guardians. This is a city which has been in a hurry to ostentatiously remake itself as part of free market Europe. The extent and the sheer volume of Tallinn's new commercial building projects are the outward signs of this headlong rush.
There is a planning authority. Its 4A's policy: assent, agree, accept, affirm, is to say yes to anything.
The triumph of laissez-faire and the subjugation of dirigisme are creating a city which, unlike the splendid old town and the meticulously disposed bourgeois suburbs, is out of control, a kind of developer's Klondike, the Wild East. The fact that certain individual buildings are distinguished is not the point. It's the cumulative free-for-all that is so disheartening, so similar to so much of Britain. Incoherence rules. Sites, materials, styles, scales, they all collide. Buildings shout each other down in a cacophony of boastful machismo. I was going to say, it's anybody's guess if this remarkable skyline will endure, but it's too late for that. We know it won't. No city has the audacity to turn back the clock, especially when yesterday was so terrible.
The last time I was on a Baltic ferry 20 years ago, a courteous, smiling fellow passenger gave my then 6-year-old twin daughters the contents of his wallet. And then he walked away, showing a surprisingly good turn of speed and the exaggeratedly poised equilibrium of the very drunk.
I felt obliged to return the money. It took an age. How do you distinguish one slumped, blonde, courteous, smiling, oblivion-seeking giant with a blood alcohol level 20 times over the driving limit from the next slumped, blonde, courteous, smiling, oblivion-seeking... Oblivion achieving, actually. They'd already achieved the northern goal of being somewhere else. In their head. Somewhere else, and some time else too. In a perpetual 1920s. In Recoleta in Buenos Aires. In a bordello where Carlos Gardel is singing forever.
Helsinki, home of the tango. Second home.
The Finnish preoccupation with tango is a mystery unless you consider it an attempt at escape which has become naturalized. You escape from the forest to the city, and you escape from the city to an illusory city. Although Jorge Luis Borges, an occasional writer of tango lyrics, named one of his protagonists after Elias Lönnrot, more of whom later, Helsinki and Buenos Aires have little in common. Buenos Aires is devoted to psychoanalysis, la bella figura, the keeping up of appearances, sex, and sobriety, without which the other four might run aground. What they do share is an almost fetishistic preoccupation with architecture and design. In Helsinki, everyone knows who built what. Tram drivers, taxidermists, dermatologists, fish gutters, students, gamblers, waitresses.
They all know, for instance, the name of the peripatetic German Karl Ludwig Engel, sometime city architect of Tallinn, who was brought to the attention of the Russian court. He was commissioned to turn the then colonial city of Helsinki into somewhere worthy of the Russian Empire.
In other words, into a lesser St. Petersburg. Engel worked in Helsinki throughout the second quarter of the 19th century, and he built so prolifically that he turned a central area of the city into a homogeneous whole.
Stately, calm, sober, imperial, obviously, pompous, ordered, efficient, and rather boring.
There's none of the flashy charlatanry and theatrical genius of John Nash in London, none of the gravity of Hamilton and Playfair in Edinburgh, none of the melancholy of Leo von Klenze at the Valhalla on the Danube, and of course none of the horizontal bombast, let alone sheer size, of St. Petersburg itself. Finns take inordinate pride, a small nation's pride, in the fact that the architect Alvar Aalto achieved such international recognition that, Sibelius apart, he is perhaps the best-known Finnish artist of the 20th century. Aalto's reputation is less comprehensible to me than his compatriots' tango mania or their taste for eau de vie flavoured with tar. His architecture was the architecture of false modesty. His buildings shout about their sensitivity. They boast how humane they are.
They don't leave me cold, far from it. They rather infuriate me.
With their coy, just off 90-degree angles, their tweely, audacious detailing, their insipid contrariness, their precocious undulations, their whimsical asymmetries, their precious tastefulness, their good manners that keep reminding you of their good manners. I am obviously missing something, for Aalto is not merely a national idol. An entire generation of British architects was enthralled to him. This was probably the last time that Britain was widely culturally beholden to the north. Though he had no direct involvement with it, the Festival of Britain had his fingerprints all over it. It was really the Festival of Aalto.
More than any other single architect, Aalto influenced the course of British design for over a decade. His example was followed in numerous artlessly arty houses that architects and all-purpose birdies built for themselves.
Aalto is to Helsinki what Charles Rennie Mackintosh is to Glasgow. Industries have grown up around both. More than cottage industries, substantial villa industries. Such commerce has caused their reputation to eclipse, to unjustly eclipse, that of artists who are their superior. Aalto's domestic renown today is at least partly due to the very fact of his having achieved international acclaim. In his lifetime, it owed much to his work being an explicit rejection of the self-consciously inward-looking, specifically Finnish architects of the previous generation. That generation's inspiration had been predominantly literary. Its architecture is encrusted with allusions to the Kalevala, the folk saga compiled from oral sources and partly invented by Elias Lönnrot in the 1820s and 30s. The Kalevala was a spur to nationalism. It's an inventory of
incest, fratricide, revenge, berserkers, virgin birth, shamans, spells, giant pike, the land called Northland, hags, elks, fratricide, incest, reincarnation, virgin birth, revenge.
By the turn of the 20th century, nationalism had become an international fashion. It was a widely prevalent mood to which the majority of Europe's smaller countries and aspirantly autonomous regions subscribed. They each attempted to create their own fittingly national architecture, an architecture that was specific to them. Catalonia, Liguria, Bohemia, Latvia, Georgia, Belgium, Lorraine. The problem was that these very different places tended to define themselves by kindred, sometimes identical means. They all adopted Art Nouveau, which perhaps defeated the point. Finland took a different route. Finnish romantic nationalism was contemporary with Art Nouveau, but owed little to it. Whatever precedents it has are to be found on the northeastern seaboard of the United States and in Scotland.
The master of this idiom was Lars Sonck, who seems never to have left his native country save to go to Sweden. This may, of course, account for his comparative obscurity. Sonck would eventually turn to a more conciliatory form of design. He got back on the straight and narrow. But as a young man, he worked in a school of wild and high originality.
The taste for back to basics, very basics, that Sonck and his contemporaries demonstrated goes far beyond that of H. Richardson in Boston or F.T. Pilkington in Edinburgh. Between 1895 and 1905, a small group of Finnish architects created some of the most elemental buildings imaginable. Well, pseudo-elemental. For the devices are decorative rather than structural. They're calculated, sophisticated essays in appearing entirely unsophisticated, highly accomplished works that try to look crude and unmade. They succeed.
This is a form of architecture that borrows from geological formations, just as music may incorporate or mimic the rush of the wind, bird song, or the gurgle of streams. It's a form of heightened naturalism. These buildings also refer to folk architecture, just as contemporary music referred to folk songs. It's a form of ancestor worship, a very distant ancestor.
It was hardly by chance that John Sibelius chose Sonck to design him a house. Sibelius is the musical equivalent of Sonck.
Romantic nationalism came to be regarded as parochial, hick. And to many Finns today, dogged devotees of modernism, it still seems faintly embarrassing. To this non-Finn, however, it seems magnificent. Romantic nationalism was necessary. It wasn't whimsical, it wasn't fanciful, it had a purpose.
Its formal exaggerations, its groundedness, its shunning of elegance, its rough and ready butchness may seem like village people turned to stone, but there was an earnest purpose. This was architecture as civil disobedience, aesthetics in the service of collective identity and political agitation in the face of Russian colonialism.
Terve metsä, terve vuori, terve metsän ruhtinas. Tässä on poikas uljas nuori, esiin käyhän voimaa täys kuin tuiva tunturin tuuli. Metsän poikaa tahdon olla sankari ylhän kuusiston, violan vainiolla karhun kanssa painii lyön, ja maailma unholaan jääköön.
Before it was used in an architectural context to describe the differently textured and incised surfaces that relieve a building's predominant material, the word rustication meant returning to the country. To rusticate an undergraduate for a misdemeanor meant to send him to the country.
Ihana on täällä rauha, urhea on taistelu. Myrsky käy ja metsä pouhaa, tulta iskee pitkäinen ja kuusi ryskyen kaatuu.
This massive rocky rustication suggests more than merely returning to the country. It represents a north that does not escape from itself by faking the south, by deluding itself about its climate, by making believe that it's somewhere that it's not. It is an architecture of realism, founded in a pragmatic response to the place where it is built. Which is not to say that it shuns escapism, but its escapism is of a contrary kind. The flight it implies has no wings, but feet weighted with stones. It offers the heavy solaces of the set, the warren, the dark warmth of hibernation. This was the architecture of a nation seeking a different state.
The doorways to these buildings are tiny apertures and cliffs of rough stone. This surely is the proper response to the benighted north, to burrow into the loam and peat we came from, to drink from the mother and satisfy our uterine longing. Womb, tomb, there's just a letter's difference. Who's to say which is the darker?